So, just a business disclaimer before I begin to read this entire story. This is story? No, this story that I'm about to read comes from a Russian site. It posted by someone named Admin. This is basically translated from Russian to English. It's by 410 Gone. Other than that, enjoy the episode. Episode 47 of Creepypasta Narrations. Today's story for this episode? Terraria, the Womb. Original author? Admin. Translated from Russian to English by someone known as 410 Gone. I hope you guys enjoy the story. Also, as a content warning, there will be mentions of graphic and content in violence and hyperrealism. What I'm about to tell you just happened just a few days ago and changed my life forever. Whether you believe it or not is entirely up to you. I, myself, remembering the details of past events, making a complete picture of what happened on the last pieces, could doubt the clarity of my own mind. But the flash drive is which I now, without letting go for a moment, the night clutched in my hands, serves as the only and undeniable proof that I have not yet gone crazy. Whether it was a happy coincidence, whether it was a blessing of gods in whom I have never believed, whether it was blind chance, I don't know what saves me. But enough of empty words. Let's get down to business. My name is... Well, it doesn't matter. Because it's not that much about me. It's enough to mention that I'm an almost third-year student. One is out of many who are now taking their last exams and they're closing their debts. I'm not a diligent student. I'm not the pride of the college, but rather an ordinary guy, still living with my mother, who likes to sit at the computer, surfing Facebook or playing with a new toy. Recently, I've been playing Terraria, and sometimes I spend whole evenings excavating cave complexes and building huge and luxurious castles on the surface. It's been 2 weeks since the internet was cut off, and there was nothing to pay for it. So I fought with only skeletons and other computer evil, without being able to break out in multiplayer and participate in large-scale project. Admittedly, I didn't really care, but it was still boring. So when my friend, whose name, again, doesn't matter much, called me and told me about the release of version 1.0.5, excitedly listing in the most tidbits from the list as changes, I immediately asked him to bring the game on a flash drive, something that would turn out to be a big mistake. The next day, June 24th, I was already throwing the new hacked version of the game into my computer, listening to my friend's valuable advice, which he had seen in the official preview. After waiting for him to leave me alone with the game, I launched the client, flipped my eyes on the inscription 1.0.5 in the lower left corner of the window, and entered single player. All maps and characters from 1.0.4 had already been carefully packed into a zip archived and removed from their respective folders. So I could start a new world from scratch, and clicking on Create Character, I quickly created quite an ordinary character. A guy with brown hair wearing a bright green jacket, blue pants, and brown boots, with a standard skin color. Naturally, the first thing I wanted to do was try out the new difficulty level, so I changed it to hardcore without a second thought. I wanted to make my character Matt, the first thing I could think of, but my finger slipped it off the keys. I wrote N instead of M. I clicked before I had time to realize my mistake. So the character was named Nat. I didn't feel like creating and coloring this character again, so I just created the world. Choosing the medium size, the game, oddly enough, didn't ask me what I wanted to name the world I was creating, but that didn't upset me at all, since I always left the name standard anyways. A minute later, the world was created automatically and named Iborn. Surprised by this strange name, I started the game. The first thing that caught my eye after loading the world was the horrible world generation. My friend, of course, warned me that in 1.0.5, there was something wrong with the generation of the worlds, which made them less beautiful than they were before. But I still was unprepared for such a drastic change. After evaluating the new features of the guide and asking him a lot about the purpose of things like acorns, wooden rungs, I went on to frantically build a hut for the first night. In the process of chopping down wood, it was discovered that there was a contaminated area at just 2 screens west of spawn, which crossed my path to the west for a while. Soon, the hut was built, however, more for show. As Nat danced over the night and outside its walls, fighting off persistent zombies with his spear and collecting the coveted 50 silver from them. The next game day was spent building small houses for the guide and the expected NPCs. And then began the usual expedition of the world, searching for weapons, mining ore, and fighting endless monsters. Through all that, Nat died several times, and each time after his death, the game threw me to the main menu, From where having reselected him from the list of characters, you can start the game on the sprue without all of your equipment. At the time, I was quite sure that this was the way it was supposed to be. And the exits to the main menu after death were just a part of the hardcore mode planned by the developers. After a few in-game days and out-of-game hours, I already had a dryad in my village, and that was wearing shadow armor. So I prioritized attacking Skeletron and ruining the dungeon. After which, I could go to the underworld with a clean soul, built myself a farm from alchemy, and just enjoyed the in-game omnipotence. Since the map to the east had already been explored down to the ocean, I headed west, emptying infested areas and killing worms angry at the destruction of the shadow orbs along the way. After a while, the dungeon was discovered, but it looks strange. First of all, there's no colony in annex where the Skeletron usually met me. Just a tower above the entrance to the ground. Inside which the damned old man was still wandering tiredly. Instead of come back again at night if you wish to enter, he instead said, come back again at night if you wish to see my master. I took this as a hint, and there was a new boss waiting for me inside the dungeon, added by the developers on 1.0.5, and was subsequently surprised that my friend hadn't mentioned it to me. Secondly, and much more importantly, coming from deep inside the dungeon and making my way through the broken roof of the tower, a strange, flesh-colored looking stalk, unknown to me, was rising. It was textured in the background, but the hook clung to it. So I, overtaken by curiosity, reached out to see where this stalk led. 300 blocks later, when I was almost convinced that the stem was purely decorative, and more interesting discoveries awaited me at the bottom of the dungeon, the scene of the world changed. The background became slightly darker, and the sky became a foreboding red color. Thinking back to Blood Moon, I immediately thought of Blood Sun, which described the appearance of the world rather accurately. Some indistinct noise played from the speaker, not unlike quiet muttering. A detail which I attributed to the developers' desire to make this new location as atmospheric as possible. After a couple of screens of climbing upwards, I shuddered when I saw what the hook had hooked to. It was a huge, twisted, and hunched embryo, the size of a flying island. But not made up of individual blocks, but solid like all monsters and bosses of Terraria. I froze for a second, feeling my own heartbeat faster, and literally urging myself to gather my thoughts and climb even higher to visit the embryo's back. After all, I'd had about the same reaction as to the Idos Consilu, except that it attacked me. And this embryo, it did nothing but rise and fall with rhythmic, calm breathing. Overpowering myself, I climbed on top of the embryo in a few leaps, and after walking on its back, I did nothing interesting. I hit with a pickaxe. There was a horrific scream, almost the loudest and most piercing I had ever seen in my life. And Nat was slain for no apparent reason. I jumped from the monitor along with my chair, catching my breath. The developers had to stop with the Lost Crescent horrors, I thought to myself, especially when it was so sudden. The game went back to the main menu, and I reached for my mouse to click on single player. Once more pointing my mouse at Nat, only to be once more stunned. Goosebumps ran down my back, and drops of sweat appeared on my forehead. Nat had changed. He turned gray, pale, his clothes faded, eyes dull, as if he hadn't seen in white light in years. Imprisoned somewhere deep underground. Barely forcing myself to click it first on his name and then the world's name, I leaned back into my chair, mentally assuring myself that the developers simply overdone their realism of the next monster. As soon as the world loaded, I was surprised once again. Even if I believed I was prepared for whatever madness there was. My small village looked like at least a century he had passed during the 2 minutes I wasn't around. There was gaps in the walls, cobwebs hanging everywhere. Almost all furnishings except chests were gone, and not a single NPC was in sight throughout the entire village. However, I soon found the reason for this. A little to the east of the village, a small graveyard had appeared with the names of all of my traders, as well as my guide, dryad, and nurse. Though, of course, those names had never been mentioned until now. Strangely, this was reassuring. I believed it was all just a clever, confessing ploy by the developers. When a couple of minutes later, all of the NPCs came to my village again. Each of them no different from the previous ones. I was finally convinced that my hypothesis was correct. It took me 2 more in-game days to regain all of my possessions. After which, I chose to return to the dungeon. When I reached it, without giving myself time to think, I immediately went to the old man, despite the fact that it was still well late at night. He still only kept saying they called me old man, and it turned out did not interfere with my progress. Leaving the obviously glitchy NPC on the surface and realizing I wasn't going to see the clothing merchant, I descended into the dungeon once more. Along with the vertical shaft was the same umbilical cord, giving me bad thoughts of what awaited me at the other end of it. I found nothing interesting in the 3 side branches of the main tunnel, and only at the bottom, where the chains of catacombs diverged from the umbilical cord. Did I start or get lucky with my prey, finding off skeletons and flying skulls? I avidly looted chests, weighing in my mind in what I should take with me and what I should leave behind, and unnoticed by myself, moving further and further to the west. At some point, I realized that the whole environment had changed. This place was no longer a dungeon, but a palace. The floor and walls also were made of 2-colored blocks that I have never seen before. There were fake paintings on the wall. There were circles on the door. Long dining tables made of carved black wood. Vases with flowers. Huge crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. And all of this was depicted down at the smallest details at the maximum resolution of the objects allowed. I would be a dirty liar to claim I had any idea how to craft any of the items I saw there. All of my attempts to break anything with a hammer or explosives were met with failure. Enemies also changed. Skeletons were replaced by humans. Not unlike randomly generated players with randomized armaments, swordsmen, mages, archers, and barbers alike all attacked me in a single crowd. Was far beyond what the AI was capable of. As if I was actually fighting other players. Finally, I arrived in the last huge room. It was akin to a throne room, with portraits of people I was unfamiliar with and gilded frames on the walls. At the western edge of the room, on a golden throne, sat someone who, according to the inscription that popped up, was called the Father. In his presence, all the enemies that were attacking me immediately ceased and left the throne room in a hurry, as if afraid of their ruler, who rose from his throne, slowly descending the steps, walking over to Nat before striking a conversation. What set him apart from all the others in Terraria was the incredible detail in his actions. He blinked, gestured freely, even when speaking, realistically moved his feet, and even occasionally scratched his own beard thoughtfully. Through all of this didn't look even close to anything that was merely scripted. When he spoke to me, a wide window of dialogue opened up. Not a sinister up a prepared text at the top of the screen, but rather a wide interface with its words, where words appeared at one at a time, as if they were being dictated to an invisible handwriter. Rather than buttons to continue or end the conversation, there was a small field at the bottom where one could write whatever they wish and enter to reply to the Father. At the moment, it didn't even occur to me to write something that did make sense or in leet speak, to see how my interlocutor would react to it. I was too scared and excited by everything that was happening. Father told me in fake terms that the embryo above the tower was a demonic child that had to be killed for the good of the world. And the only way could only be killed by descending even lower, into a kind of womb, to find in the base of the umbilical cord and cut it. Any questions I had about his identity were ignored by the Father, but he only did answer one question. What happens if I don't? In response, he turned to face the screen, looking directly at me, and said, "You will die." At that moment, I thought I could hear his voice saying those simple words, which, however, scared me far more than even the child itself I had seen in the sky. They were not addressed to my character, but rather to me, sitting in front of the screen, trembling in fear. Again, I can hardly console myself with the thought that it was all part of a beautiful and very convincing installation. A quest from the NPCs. Also, the large number of strange things I had seen still kept me horrifically wary. The father fell silent and didn't say another word, nor did he answer the many questions I tried to ask him. I had no choice but to return and through the empty corridors of the palace, back to the dungeon, tormented by a fake and pratt pre-motion. When I reached the umbilical cord, I felt a strong, spontaneous urge to close and delete the game, once and for all, never to log into it again, and never tell anyone what exactly had happened to me today. However, I was able to overpower the desire, once again convincing myself that nothing had happened yet, that in theory could not be added by the developers to the new version, and as such began to descend. After a while of going downwards, some very strange things began to happen. First, the melody of the dungeon gradually faded and changed into the one that played when I saw the embryo. Second, the usual monsters disappeared, and the speakers began to play constantly rustling sounds that usually played when worms or bone diggers dragons appear. Although nothing similar to them appeared. Gradually, the blocks that made up the passage, which already seemed endless to me, began to be replaced by new ones unknown to me, like Kev's dead, realistic greenish flesh. Eventually, the background also changed to pulsing pale tissue with trembling green flames. I even thought I could smell nauseating odor emanating from this strange place, though I am certain it was more than my imagination. It was undoubtedly the womb. Only the umbilical cord seemed unending. I was really scared. I was going to just mess around today, kill bosses, experiment with new additions, and ultimately have fun. But I didn't plan to do with shit myself this hard. On the bright side, up to a certain point it was really interesting. I wanted to pass this unforeseen quest and then finally be sure this game wasn't one gargantuan anomaly. Alas, that's not how it went. Over time, monsters finally appeared in the room. They strangely were different from all the other monsters in the game. Solid pieces of overly realistic meat. No two of them were ever being the same. Some were many times larger than the character could, and could only traverse tunnels. Some, on the contrary, were the size of only a few pixels and were pack groups. When you put the cursor over any of them, neither the name nor the number of life is displayed. And when you hit them, the amount of damage dealt did not pop up. Also, it was possible to kill the monsters. Just that doing so was problematic. Needless to say, the next morning, I didn't want to play at all. Without turning on my computer once, I got dressed, ate breakfast, and went out for a walk to get some fresh air and unwind. This walk had a calming effect on me against the beautiful inaudibility of the real world. Yesterday's spiritual horror seemed absurd and petty. So I decided to call my friend who brought me the game and told him what happened. He listened with excitement. He himself had not played 1.0.5 yet. Rather, having spent all of yesterday dealing with viruses that had infected his computer. But he saw everything that had happened as well as what I wanted to think it was. Nothing more than a very fleshed out adventure from some developers. Essentially, curiosity triumphed over fear. And I returned home to the game back on. Nat was missing. So I had no choice but to create a new character. A black girl named Alice. I opened and born, and then continued to play the game. Nothing had changed. NPCs walked aimlessly around the rebuilt village, occasionally wandering into the cemetery, which I never decided to destroy. The cemetery? Something about it caught my attention, making me remember something that could help me. Tombstones. That's right. There was a tombstone where Nat died, and it should disclose how he died. Not that I doubted it was some kind of backwoods thing. It just made me damn curious to see what it would say. Besides, around the same place where a chest was with swords, which I didn't want to continue descending without, and doing so wasn't possible, because I didn't know how long it would take to go down. I was about to head for the dungeon when I belatedly realized I was completely out of health potions. I went back to the merchant, talked to him, went to the trade menu, bought up, and having already stopped talking, realized that something was wrong. I turned again and froze. They will tell tales of Nat someday. I didn't know how to understand it. It seemed that the merchant was aware of Nat's death, as if he was hinting at something. From the next address, everything became clear. Nat, is it? I've heard good things, friend. The merchant apparently mistook my character for Nat because of some glitch. However, not only the merchant, but also all the other NPCs each of whom had personal addresses to the player. Hey Nat, wanna buy a brick friggin' gun, huh? My god, Nat, wanna buy a big friggin' gun, huh? My god, Nat, were you bathing in lava? Nat? Such a good name. I'll name my next bomb Nat. I could go on. The glitch was insignificant, but it was enough to give me another bad feeling deep down. Fully armed, I headed west again, reaching the entrance to the dungeon. I began the long descent. This time, it seemed to me that the blocks of the womb started much closer to the palace than before. As if it was increasing in size, eating away at the blocks of stone and bricks of the dungeon. The thing that was frightening, in addition to the death gauge, where I also had my watch with me, immediately after entering the room, they malfunctioned and stopped telling time, displaying only room, hail, and path, depending on where Alice was at the moment. It was getting darker in the room, clearly earlier this time than last, and the ominous music in the background gradually grew louder and more distinct. Moaning voices, which I associate with the singers from the second circle of Dante's Inferno, began to break through the bone-chilling, glooming music, which consisted with me mainly of the measured thuds of drums and the low notes of some stringed instrument. They had been heard before, but now it had definitely become something more than ambience. At the same time, as far as I could see with the damn flashlight, something was happening to the backdrop of the room. Some faces or body parts seemed to be appearing, but no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't be certain whether or not they were a figment of my imagination. As I continued descending, the monsters became more realistic and frightening, trying to go into a dark side of the tunnel off the central path with an umbilical cord. I almost immediately ran into something that dealt 150 damage in one hit. I jumped back and swung my sword erratically. Immediately, as if it's taunting me, a single firefly flew from the central tunnel, illuminating my enemy. It was a giant, half-decomposed head with no lower jaw, had a long tongue, and that was so realistically drawn as to where I gagged and jerkily turned away from the screen to avoid seeing it. When I finally got over myself and turned back to the screen again, the head was gone. Now, there was just a dead end of the same pulsing flesh, and the firefly. I didn't want to stay in the dark corridor, especially after what just happened. So I returned to the cord and continued descending. Soon, I reached the place where Nat had died. Everything was still intact. The golden chest, the makeshift dome that had saved the character from death, his parts, the blood everywhere, tombstone. I felt sick at the sight of it. Even though it was all painted, bodies disappear after death, don't they? Terraria doesn't even have that kind of realistic killing, does it? It doesn't have blood, does it? It's a game, isn't it? I pulled myself together. Yeah, it's a game. Yes, realistic deaths are featured across the developers. And so, was this whole place. Yeah, I was lying to myself with that stupid excuse. But what else could I say? Everything that was happening to me and my character should be justified by the developer's logic. Even if some intuitive part of my mind resisted the idea, I headed to the tombstone and read the cause of Nat's death. Nat was taken by the mother. What? For the second time in the last 2 days, if I felt like quitting, deleting the game and never thinking about that journey through the room again. But I didn't have it in me. My mind was spinning with stupid, absurd thoughts, imagining what would happen if I didn't kill the child father warned me about. Imagining how I, the real me, wouldn't be engulfed by pulsing walls at night. Or worse. However, amidst the madness that came over me, one coherent thought came through. Father, child, womb, and mother. Those names, as simple as they are, can't possibly be coincidental. No, there was a pattern, yet the meaning of it was still unknown to me. If I already had seen into father, child, and womb, I had no idea who the mother was. Part of me assumed that we'd be a boss of sorts, or at the bottom of the womb, for the sake of which the whole frightening quest was being carried out. It had already drawn on me a giant worm or something similar, from which the umbilical cord begins. But there was only one problem. This place did not obey a rational judgment, or of course, maybe it did, rather masquerading as reality as not to reveal its citizens. The thought sickened me more, but I must persist. I took another nice edge out of my chest, and like eating my weight with it. Continued down the umbilical cord, fighting off the organic monsters. Several times since I wanted to stop, if not quit the game, at least go to the kitchen and get something to eat. At the same time, it appeared as if I already descended a good 40,000 feet below sea level, and I didn't want to go back to the spawn, or especially to build a dome around myself again and pause the game. So, fighting hunger, thirst, and fatigue, I kept going and going. The voices in the background got even louder, overpowering the music. They were whispering to each other in a language I couldn't come close to identifying. If anything, it was more akin to an imitation of a hawk's croak than a human speech. And the moans eventually turned into sobs, cries, and sometimes even cries of pain. I muted the speaker so my mom wouldn't hear all these sounds, but doing that still didn't help a lot. Suddenly, everything changed. The screen twitched, went out for a second, came back on, and while nothing changed at first glance, I noticed almost immediately that the background was warping and seemed to flow toward where Alice was. I freaked out and ran even faster, not staying still for a second, but whatever was in the background, it was faster. The voices stopped whispering and drew out a long, long note. Low at first, like the hum of a cello. Then higher and higher, until finally it turned into a shrill and terrifying screech. At the bottom of the screen, its wrath has awoken. And the flesh of the womb in the background twisted, something large, several times the size as the character oblong, and still sharp teeth, separated from it, and enlarging in almost the entire background screen, closed its jaws on Alice, then immediately disappeared again. Simultaneously with the terrifying and insanely realistic creator of its jaws closing, the voices fell silent, finally cutting off that horrific screeching. I, frozen, stared at the monitor with glazed eyes, unable to even move in front of this spectacle. When it was over, I unclenched my clenched fist and reached for the keyboard to see what happened. But Alice wasn't moving the way I wanted her to. She was turned to the screen and on her left, slowly swayed as if to keep balance on her one leg. And all of a sudden, and in an animation that was completely impossible in terms of realism for Terraria, she turned to the screen on the other side and fell. She was missing the entire right half of her body, which had been bitten off by the thing. You can absolutely see everything. Insides, bones, skull section, everything was so damned realistic. As if a real person was cut with a perfectly straight blade, photographed and made into a body texture for Alice. In the middle of the screen, melancholy lit up with the inscription, "You were slain." And after a second, another one. Again. Then, the game flew back to the main menu. Alice disappeared from the character list. My heart was pounding so hard that it felt like it was going to burst through my chest at any moment if I couldn't console myself and keep up with the pace. But my head was empty by this point. It felt like some kind of silent hysteria. It was as if I was watching myself aloofy, without thoughts or worries, when I should have been dying of fear. I guess by then I couldn't handle it anymore. I caved in this madness, whatever it is, I thought. However, and whatever it costs me, I must continue. Still as detached as ever. I logged into single player, created a new character, an old man named Eric. Loaded in Highborn and continued playing. Here, my sanity returned, and I was instantly enveloped in a sticky web of fear. Now it seemed as if not only the game had no plans to release me, but I had become obsessed with the mystery and trying to get to the bottom of it. As if the world, as far as I could see, nothing had changed outwardly. So I, still crazy terrified of what it had happened, began arming Eric. The monsters mistook the characters for Nat, but now it was as if they were more cautious and less trusting. Up to a certain point, I took it for a figment of my own disturbed imagination, which was mixing up fantasy and reality. But then, something unexpected happened. Having crafted Phoenix Blaster, yes, by this point I already had been to the underground world and made sure it was impossible to get it into the womb from there, as well as to go below the usual edge of the map. I waited for a long time for the meteorite to fall in order to make ammunition out of it. But then, without waiting, I went to the arms dealer to buy something bad. Some bad, but still some ammunition. Even then, with in the same window open into when I talked to him and when I talked to Father, I clearly realized that something horrific was inbound. Nat? Stop. You're not Nat. You're not. The words appeared one by one, as if the merchant is actually speaking in a sentence. What have you done? I know. I know. God's pain. Blood. Womb. They're all gonna die, Nat. Can you hear me? They're all gonna die. And you, devil child, will be the first one. With an extremely deliberate movement, he drew a pistol, apparently from his shoulder holster, pulled the bolt, and fired twice at Eldritch Shed. I flinched. The sounds weren't what they usually were. Not the beast as a toy gun, but a real loud resounding shots, accompanied by the distinct audible release of the safety and the falling shell casings. The bullets went through Eric, doing no damage and smashing into the wall. The arms dealer backed down, lowering his weapon. For a second, I saw real, genuine horror on his face. And the window then added, well then. The window closed, and the merchant turned and ran through the open doors of the houses, each one putting a few bullets into their occupants. The sounds of gunfire came out the speakers in machine gun bursts. And at the bottom of the screen appeared the captions. Martha Negon killed Clayton Brawl. Emilio Ocon unsecure literary had tasted and Martha Negron's steel. Airwig Skyslade has been shot by Martha Negon. Again, I could go on. I ran after him, on the run, horrified to see the results of the massacre that Martha had performed on in just a few seconds. The bullets had found their victims, and the blood was already over the walls and furniture, and sometimes whole pieces of meat were lying around in movable corpses, running through all the houses. Then I realized that the crazed merchant was in the cemetery. In the morning twilight, when the moon was already below the horizon and the sun was yet to rise, Masta was kneeling at the farthest grave, whispering something to himself. It's distinct whispering coming from the speakers. Instantly, I realized I had heard that whisper before. Deep in the womb. Among dozens of other frightening monologues, Masta removed the clip from his gun, examined it, and said, "Last one." And with a final glance over his shoulder at Eric, put the firearm in his mouth and pulled the trigger. Blood mixed with brains, meat, and skull fragments spread out the back of his head, and Mazda turned his gaping wound towards the screen, fell to his side, and froze. Now all of them are dead, Nat, came belatedly from the bottom of the screen. The sun hadn't risen in any way. The twilight sky had undergone a blood-red hue. Time froze, and now even the newly crafted clock showed path. I didn't care, however, for time had already fallen out of my memory, and I came to my senses when Eric was standing at the entrance of the dungeon, which was no longer a dungeon. Every block was now part of the organic material that made up the womb, and the clock entrance immediately switched. At the entrance immediately switched to womb. As you likely guessed, the dungeon is simply no more, now a part of the womb. After descending where the palace once began, I ventured away from the umbilical cord and headed westward, wanting to see the father again. The characters that had attacked me before had changed, now looking like they had been hastily sewn together from torn pieces of their own bodies, and the weapons I was familiar with were replaced with bloody hooks akin to medieval torture devices. The Walking Dead whispered something I could already hear in the chorus of voices that haunted me in the womb. When I finally got to the throne room, it looked radically different. Portraits of aristocrats on the walls had changed to depict like a few of the many monsters I had met in the womb. All the furnishings were half rotten, and in place of the father's throne was a head with a severed jaw. Unable to bear the sight and barely restraining myself from screaming, I charged for the umbilical cord, continuing my descent without realizing my own goal. Already navigating blindly into the darkness that surrounded me right there and then, I reached the same golden chest that died and opened it. Inside was a knife's edge and the same mystery blade. The latter still couldn't be taken, so I simply made do with the knife's edge and continued to move deeper into the womb, lighting the way it was to blaze every swing. After, as far as I knew, 50,000 blocks of death, my cursor disappeared from the screen, and all other elements of the interface soon followed suit, leaving only a blank screen with my character and the womb. I could no longer open my inventory, and items no longer popped up in captions. Monsters from the background, not like those that had slain Alice, continued to appear deep water. But when I literally immediately developed a tactic, first as far down as possible, then simply change direction and climb up. Deadly bites were avoided with this new strategy as mine. Though, such maneuvers still slowed my progress downwards. Some of the sized tunnels I had previously encountered in the womb were partially overgrown with flesh, though it was possible to get through them if I wanted to. Yet I didn't. Starting around 70,000 blocks deep, the monsters in the background started appearing. It seemed that the game realized that it couldn't stop me this time, and now it hurriedly developing me other tactics. At some point, the voices died down, and they were replaced by rustling and slurping sound. And that sounded like to me like the sound of rotting meat being thrown into the mouths of after they ate dogs, and the surface of the blocks that organized the tunnel began to change. Almost immediately, I noticed that the organics began to move. At first, they were covered with thousands of small tentacles, and there was some inconsistency and regularly into the form. Normally random pulsing movement of the walls. Now this place was a living organism, striving to absorb the interloper. Soon, spiky growths began to appear on the walls of the womb. The tentacles lengthened, and the flesh itself, which was merely pulsing, began to shudder rhythmically like muscles. A slow, squelching sound came from somewhere, growing louder and louder with each repetition, until at last it became a distinctly human scream. Something seemed to be approaching from deep within the tunnel. With the walls of the womb responded to every cry of this unknown creature, the screen began to blink. It was impossible to tell whether it was the womb or the monitor itself that was darkening. And in between the screens, a white noise passed around the edges of the screen. I tried to turn off the speakers because the noise was being too loud, but the switch on the speakers seems to be stuck. And I couldn't bring myself to take my eyes off the screen for a second and unplug the cord. I didn't want to. Again, amidst the screaming, a shell swept behind Eric, or rather, seemed to blend into him from on the background. After which, I lost control of him as he jerked convulsively before unnaturally turning slowly to the screen. His mouth moved slowly, as if Eric was trying to say something, but I couldn't read his lips no matter how hard I tried. Suddenly, the old man twisted his whole body with terrifying ease, ran his hands up his chest, and ripped it open, and with sickeningly realistic sounds tearing skin and breaking bones. But instead of viscera, skeleton, or anything else, there was only a pulsing darkness inside, blacker than black itself, which, as if reluctantly, released thin tentacles from the chest as does the still standing old man, and launched them into the rest of his body. Eric pulled himself away from where this something had caught him, and slowly rose into the air, and began to change. His legs lengthened and became covered with his spiky growth. An additional pair of slings grew from his shoulders, like mantis sickles or folded wings. His head retracted into his flattened torso, and an eye with 3 pupils opened in the middle of his former chest, each eye moving independently of the others flying across the screen, focusing almost immediately on me. What was once my character gathered itself into a lump, tore straight at the screen, instantly growing in size. The last thing I saw was a paw stretched out towards the screen, its jaw grinning with thousands of small, ludicrously sharp teeth. Finally, you were slain. The game went back to the main menu. The lights were frozen. The sky was still blood red. And the music was gone. Instead, replaced by the humming of the womb's voices, the only item was the end. I guess I was still under a great deal of stress, which was the only explanation for the fact that my hand reached out, not for the shutdown button on the computer, not for the cord, not for my phone, but for the mouse to click on the only remaining option. I didn't have it in me to scream, and before I knew it, I had bitten my tongue and was swallowing blood convulsively. Every cell in my body was shrinking, and fear had overtaken me entirely. Not fear of the obvious, nor the hyperrealism, but of the unknown, of what lies in wait at the bottom of the womb. But that was it. Even if nothing had changed in the main menu, and the Mithley blade wasn't waiting for me on my way to the womb, I still realized with ease that this would be my final journey into that womb. I could just feel it. And now, the only answer remaining was how this all ends. If I had seen myself from the outside, I was to lead the game and forget it in the next morning. But it's one thing to spectate, and another to participate. The world loaded immediately, and I didn't even have to load anything or even create a new character. The character was Nat, as he was us from the beginning, without any armor. The interface was nowhere to be found, and I couldn't open my inventory, nor could I open any chests. The world was still the same in perpetual state of blood-red twilight. Nothing had changed in the village. The bodies of the NPCs were still lying in their places in their same postures. Their blood still covered the walls and floor. Nat had a very strange gimmick this time, however. A tool appeared in his hand, and when I could have used one. If I, sitting behind the screen, wanted to use the hook, Nat did. If I wanted to shoot, he did. If I wanted to swing a sword, he did. If I wanted to dig, he did. He literally complied with my every thought. Even if I wish to use a tool or weapon in a way that said tool or weapon shouldn't be used. Quite the opposite, in fact. I couldn't use anything for their intended purpose for some odd reason. There was 3 changes in the world. All monsters, whether or not they were the organic behemoths I saw all at odds with for so long, were nowhere to be found. And in some places, chunks of pulsating flesh, exactly like the womb were under the ground. Rebuilding this world wasn't an option anymore. Not even ordinary blocks of earth could be broken with a red-hot pickaxe. The only thing that was perfectly fine was the hook, which I had to resort to several times on my way to what was once the dungeon. In addition, Nat was permanently equipped with a watch, now showing wound at all times, and a depth gauge. I headed towards the wound once more, while taking a look around on what was left of the world. It was being ate away by the contagion, and that had come from the womb. Whether it came in contact with the surface, the same moving growths were growing instead of grass, and the trees were turning into twisted limbs. In the colorless raw meat, the infected bodies of water turned a purple hue, as if they were filled with blood. I didn't want to think about it, lest I lose my mind. Instead of one of the hills on the way west, I found a huge pile of moving meat that I didn't even bother touching. Instead, opted to circle all it with a wooden dome. And, as mentioned, there are monsters missing all over the world. Aside from the growth, everything was lifeless. It was even more frightening than the unspeakable horrors lurking in the darkness of the womb. If any monster could be explained as an AI, then the emptiness, gloom, and determination of this world seemed to be amassed by a ruthless mind, and that was putting on a play where I was the victim. I can't even approximately imagine and how right I was in these thoughts of utter fear. When I reached the entrance to the former dungeon, however, I suddenly wished I could see the child. The umbilical was still growing through the roof of the organic tower, and clinging to it with a hook. Nat climbed up. It was no longer an embryo when I first saw it. It had taken up a total of 4 screens, like a flying island, but now it took up several times more space and looked like a formally formed human infant. He was ready to be born, but just as what he did his birth mean for this world, and more importantly for me? I can't stay there. It was simply far too discovering as a sight. Nat jumped down. I didn't even think about the fact that he might crash. Either way, however, it didn't happen. The infected blocks next to the tower seemed to sag, stopping Nat's fall. And a second layer pushed him out. Then I thought to myself, if that just happened, then what could only mean in the womb didn't want me dead? No, it had other plans for me. I realized I was already identifying myself with Nat. God, that was creepy. In any case, the only way was down, and I was obligated to go down by this point. Nat started down, and there I saw that the room had changed the only one way. Off the side passages and offshoots, including the former palace, were overgrown. And now the path I followed was not an inch away from the umbilical cord. I never met a single monster, but at times it seemed that shell silhouettes were appearing. Were they characters? The NPCs? Sometimes I thought I saw Masa Nagon, grinning in the shadow with a hole on his skull. Other times I saw the shadows change until Eric slipping into the background, a grinning gnat, and others I met it over the past 2 days in played as. The disgusting, unidentifiable stench of the womb once more wafted into my nostrils. But the voices were gone. It was all absolute silence. Besides the sound of the act himself, the repugnant sounds of the womb, and myself frantically being carved. By this point, I was afraid to even open my mouth and say anything, for it seemed the womb would hear me and do its worst with it. Eventually, Nat had finally gone into the golden chest. There was still no cursor, and the whole interface hadn't appeared, so I wondered how I was going to get the last sword out of there. But I didn't need to. As soon as I brought Nat to the chest, he opened it by himself with an animation I fairly sure shouldn't exist, and took the blade. It was a horrid sight. It was oozing hyper-realistic blood and dripping from the blade with every movement. The quiet sounds of every drop coming from the speakers. It couldn't be used more than once every 5 seconds. But the light from the strike lit up the entire screen at once, even if it faded quickly. Now, armed once more, Nat continued his descent, while I was attempting to reconstruct the events that had happened in the room with the previous characters. This was where Nat had died, and the dome I hoped to hide him in was gone, blood still dripping down its walls. I turned to see the severed head, but now the passage was overgrown with flesh. Over here was where something had brutally killed Alice. Blood was still flowing from that very spot, as if the corpse wasn't going anywhere. Here was where the wound was first changing. Small tentacles still moving on the pulsing walls. And here something had possessed Eric and it was trying to attack me. With the blade's every swing, not only did the pictures appear, but also the image of the same places. When the womb wasn't like this. When I saw the monsters, it was much easier. I knew who and where to hit. I knew what wasn't there to fear. I saw the target. I knew, but now it's just the unknown. Something of true fear. That was where the room finally stopped. The passage widened and gave way to a huge cavern, akin to an enriched inferno. Instead of blocks of dust and hellstone, there lied flesh and bone. And instead of lava, there was blood. The death gauge, as if waiting for me to see what it had displayed, unknown feet below, finally disappeared along with the clock. leaving me in this dark place. I had traveled 100,000 blocks deep by this point. And now it was finally time to find out what caused this madness. The cave led me west, but not for long. After a while, there appeared a palace, the same one that was in the dungeon, only altered. Everything was comprised of carefully mixed human and monster parts. The floor, walls, furnishings, absolutely everything was there it was before. And just like how things were in here before it, was overtaken. But all of the beauty was replaced by filth. It was disgusting. There were arms, legs, heads, wings, bones, slugs, bats, whole parts of bosses as bricks in the walls. Everything was combined to make this. Almost immediately, I stepped foot in the main hall. The portraits of those of all of my dead characters and NPCs. Nat, Alice, Eric, Martha Nagon, and other merchants, all depicted as they were in the moment of their deaths. At the farthest edge of the hall, rather than a throne, there was again the same head whose forehead that the cord had started from. And on its outstretched tongue, not unlike a throne, sat the father, leaning boredly on his arm, looking at Nat and the remains lying before him. The remains of those depicted on the portraits. Father slowly rose from his throne, arrogant as ever, walked out on the steps to Nat and spoke. That was the part that really made me flinch. Father's voice wasn't in the speakers, but in my head. So you're here, Nat. We can finally get this over with. Do you have anything to say before you die? I didn't pay attention to the fact that I had no microphone. It was obvious that I didn't need one. I could barely squeeze out the one question that had been on my mind most. If you haven't already guessed, in your world, I'm a virtual death at generation error. Let's put it this way. Because as a whole in the code of my world, the one who was supposed to be responsible for the troubles of the whole world was created, I am the map's answer to the question that never entered your head. It's simply because it was outside your thinking boundaries. Who cursed the old man guarding the dungeons? Who created the dungeons itself? Where did the monsters throughout the world come from? Where did the contamination zones and the ice of Cthulhu come from? To you, it's all made up by the developers. For them, too. But it's not enough for my world. I am the consistency of all the evil that infected countless worlds you create for your amusement. And that entitles me to some privileges. The father walked past Nat. Once he was behind him, he turned to the screen in with the left side of his body And when he did, what I saw wasn't even darkness or lack of texture. No, it was an absolute void that was scary to touch the glass of the monitor. That seemed to overtake obviously everything nearby. Is that better? What do you want to know? Oh, now. Who is mother? What is child? Why did I lure you into the womb? I nodded frantically, unable to utter a sound. But that seemed to be enough for father. Well, there's no rush. You're not going anywhere anyway, I said to my relief. If that word's even applicable in the state he was in. Father turned back to the normal side of the screen and returned to the throne. Mother, I'm surprised you didn't guess. Mother is the world, and the child is my successor, for whom she grows through the womb I created. But there is one small difference. I am confined to these fictional worlds, but not the child. As soon as it is born, it will be in both worlds at once, Nat. Yours and mine. It will create a new womb in your world and overtake it just as it had overtaken this one. But you can't create something beyond one world. That's why we needed sacrifices, Nat. Yes, sacrifices. All the people you like to call your characters and like to believe your avatars are interlopers into here. You took them to the womb and fed them to the mother, who used the energy to raise the child. The people of your village became individuals as well, and you know what happened then. And now you, the last living souls this world, are here. Everyone else is no more to support the mother until your arrival. You're the last link in my plan, Nat, and I'm grateful to you for coming in time. Now, if you'd be so kind as to die. Die! I shouted that one under the top of my lungs, not realizing what I was doing. And Nat charged toward father, swinging his sword. I realized with horror that I could see the smug smile on his face. But by then, it was already far too late. Just as the sword was about to come in half, father stepped into the background, took the blade from Nat's hand, and one blow beheaded him. A fountain of blood erupted from his neck, and he collapsed. But that wasn't the point. The screen shook and began to blink. Several bites from the ceiling and father, the sword now slung over his shoulder, stood smiling at me through the monitor. The last thing I saw then was the caption at the bottom. The child has awoken. I immediately slapped my hand on the power button of the system unit. The computer immediately and readily shut down. But I felt as if that wasn't enough. Obsessed with the only thoughts of deleting the game and everything related to it, I better just format the disk. I turned it back on. At least I would if it didn't do so on its own without even booting up. At that moment, it immediately showed a shaky screen, with father walking around the remains of all of my characters. Hugh looked at me and said, "Too late." I looked down at my hands. To my indescribable horror, the keyboard had turned into a very organic as the womb. The keys were placed by the forest, a slimy tentacles crawling for my fingers. The mouth was covered in bone. Becoming like a ribcage with the same umbilical cord coming engulfed instead of a wire. The screen blurred, and the walls of the system unit turned into the walls of the womb. I screamed and fell backwards with the chair. At the same time, there was a stomping sound. And in the next room, and my mom burst into the room. "What happened?" I can't answer anything. So I only poked my finger at the computer, which I had probably done a few times already at my point. Madly, as my mother told me later, looking at it, I jumped to my feet as if possessed by something. Towards the side covers the system. Inside, I saw a piece of flesh from the womb. In place of the hard disk, which was reaching with its thin, slimy tentacles for me. Then I grabbed the whole system at once, pulling the cords and dropping the monitor onto the floor, before running over to the window, hurling the system right onto it, breaking the glass. The thing fell 12 stories and crashed into the car parked below, and I passed out on the spot. I think you can guess what happened next. I was tested for drug use and mental state for a long time. And as a result, they found nothing but severe fatigue and stress, aggravated by temporary mental confusion. I was prescribed some pills. And it's been without a computer for 3 weeks now. But that was the end of it. We paid compensation to the owner of the machine, but the hard drive I was raving about was not found in the system, and there was searched out while it was out. The only proof that this all happened and was not happening in delirium remains the pictures I took to the game. I'm detecting this text to my friend, because I'm afraid to go anywhere near a computer. And you know what? I'm not going to tell you don't play Terraria. It's stupid. I realized it myself. Even in terms of the story told by Father, it's not like every world generates the quintessence of evil. I'm just saying, there are times you shouldn't give a fuck about curiosity. Don't repeat my mistakes. P.S. I was dreaming about the womb every night since.